Hi, I'm Vicky Bowskill, a PhD researcher at the Open University, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about the science of meadows. We'll explore what meadows are and why they're important for both nature and farming. Then we'll look at how the things we do to manage our meadows can affect the life that calls them home. I'll also share a bit about how we do field research to help us better understand these meadows. I'll show you 3 short videos filmed back in the summer on my study sites, and we'll talk about some of the topics they cover. So let's begin with this 2-minute video introducing my research filmed at Oxley Mead near Oxford. Try and notice how many different species you can spot in the video. Meadows are a fantastic place to see an abundance of wildlife, but they're not as wild as you might think. They're an ancient part of our agricultural landscape that has evolved from the need to produce hay to feed to livestock. But, as the saying goes, they don't make it like they used to. Meadow species have adaptations and life habits that enable them to thrive on British floodplains under the annual cycle of summer hay cutting and aftermath grazing in the autumn that has been shaping these plant communities for centuries. However, since World War II, some 97% of our precious wildflower meadows have been lost due to agricultural intensification and changes in land use. Oxley Mead is a floodplain meadow sitting on the northern bank of the River Thames, and these wet meadows are especially diverse, with up to 40 plant species for every square metre, supporting a wide range of other wildlife. Floodplain meadows have long been valued as a low-input, naturally fertile farm resource, and their species-rich hay can still provide a broad nutrient profile and plant medicinal compounds for pasture-fed livestock. The reason floodplain meadows are so fertile is the nutrient-rich sediments that are deposited on them when they flood. However, if soil nutrients are allowed to build up too much, the biodiversity in the meadow can fall as the tall, competitive grass species crowd out the smaller, more delicate wildflowers. So it's important to keep the fertility in balance, and the best way to do that is to take an annual hay crop that physically removes all the nutrients that have been taken up by the plants as they grow. The timing of haymaking is a critical part of successful meadow management that's always been governed by the vagaries of weather and seasons. Modern haymaking has a very different impact on sensitive meadow species, with hay often cut later to protect ground nesting birds, and modern machinery allowing large areas to be covered much more quickly. Cutting hay later can be perceived to make a lower quality crop, with nutrients thought to fall as the summer goes by. There's a need to better understand how the nutritional and medicinal content of hay changes during the growing season to bring the production of a valuable hay crop back into balance with biodiversity conservation, and this is where my research is focused. You can see I've been collecting some hay samples here this morning that I'll be analysing in the lab later. With a changing policy landscape and focus on sustainable food production, it's more important than ever to understand how our heritage hay meadows can continue as part of a sustainable, nature-friendly farming future. So how many species did you manage to spot? There's too many to go through all of them, but here's 3 that you might have recognised. Does anyone know what they're called? On the left we've got the great burnet, in the middle is the oxeye daisy, and on the right is black knapweed. And this snazzy little black and red moth is the burnet moth. Though it's not feeding on the great burnet here, it's enjoying a taste of devil's bit scabious. It's a strange name, isn't it? Devil's bit scabious. Well, you can tell a lot about a plant if you know its name. There are several varieties of scabious, and the reason that they're called that is because they were used to treat scabies and other itchy skin conditions, including the sores caused by the bubonic plague. And the name scabies comes from the Latin word for scratch. But why devil's bit? Well, this particular species has a short black root, and folklore tells that the reason for that is that the devil bit off the root in revenge for curing those ailments. But common names can be confusing because they can be quite regional. The same plant will have a different name in a different region or a different country. So as botanists, we have to be very careful to use Latin names so we don't get confused between the different species. And the Latin names can also tell you quite a lot. So for the devil's bit scabious, the Latin name Succissa pratensis basically means the same thing. The succissa comes from a Latin word meaning to reap or to break at the bottom. So that's like the devil's bit part. And anything that's pratensis or pratensi basically means of a meadow, or to be found in a meadow. So when you understand what the names mean, they can tell you quite a lot. If you're interested in learning to identify species, you can check out iSpot. You can visit their website and download the app on your phone so you can explore your nature finds when you're out and about. You can pause this video and go and log on to the iSpot website. Try looking up your area to see which species have been found near you, or search for the species that we've just been looking at to see where they've been found. Take 10 minutes to do this now. So now we've had a look at some of the meadows and some of the species you might see in them, let's talk about what meadows are. So what exactly is a meadow? As you heard in the video, they're not a wild habitat. They're part of our farmed landscape. But what does that mean? Well, there are two main types of grassland that you'll see in our countryside, though there's lots of variation within those. Pastures are grazed all year round, whereas meadows are allowed to grow tall during the spring and early summer, and they're cut for hay sometime usually between June and September. There may also be grazed for a time in the autumn to remove that late summer growth, and we'll be looking at why the timing of that hay cut is so important for meadow life. But why aren't all grasslands filled with wildflowers? Well, some grasslands are ploughed and sown with just a few plant species that are fast growing and packed with protein. These may be grazed all year round, and they're often cut for silage. This is what we call agriculturally improved grassland, and it requires lots of fertiliser inputs to keep those hungry grasses growing. You may have seen those sleek, shiny grasses rippling like water on a windy summer day. Wildflower meadows, on the other hand, are not ploughed and sown, but result from the traditional farming methods and may be hundreds of years old. When managed carefully, they can support over 40 plant species for every square metre. This wonderful diversity of plants supports hundreds of species of insects, birds, mammals and other life. To understand grassland management, we need to understand a bit about ecological succession, and that's how habitats naturally tend to evolve if left to themselves. If we start on the left-hand side of this diagram, ancient organisms will take many thousands of years to weather rocks and build up thin primitive soils. Larger, more complex plants, what we call higher plants, are then able to settle and take root in those thin soils and to build them up further. Plants, invertebrates, fungi have all been involved in building up the deep soils that we see today, and it took them thousands of years, and that's why soils are so valuable. If we damage them, they can't be replaced quickly. Grasslands can and do occur naturally across the planet, where there are large grazing species to nibble off all the larger plants when they try and grow. But before humans started farming, much of the land would have been covered with woodlands, which is where succession has reached its peak on the right-hand side of this diagram. But what happens if you cut the woodland down? Well, succession of plant communities should start again, but not all the way back from the beginning. At the bare rock stage, it would be rolled back to the middle of this diagram where the grasses and smaller herbaceous plants are growing. Animal grazing, or hay cutting, can maintain this grassland stage of succession indefinitely, as tree seedlings are grazed or cut off every year. And that's how our most biodiverse meadows have formed, and they've been maintained in that way for centuries. This diagram actually comes from a module on the OpenLearn website about fire ecology. You can find lots of brilliant modules on OpenLearn on all sorts of topics, and they're all free, so do check that out. So you can think of succession applying to the soil, not just to the vegetation. The developing plant life we looked at helps to build the soils, which become ever deeper. There's actually more life in the soils and more species down in the soil than there is above ground, especially in grasslands, where the above ground part of plants is actually quite small compared to the underground parts. In this diagram, you can see the dark areas showing the organic parts where the carbon is stored. You can see that grasslands can store a large amount of carbon in their deep soils. If you compare it to the forests on the left-hand side of the diagram, where most of the carbon is stored above ground in the woody parts of plants. But not all grasslands are the same. When you plough the soil, a lot of that stored carbon from the soil is released. And if you sow it with just 2 or 3 different species, the roots are quite shallow and they aren't able to build up those very deep soils. And when they're grazed all year round, the soils can be quite compacted from all the hoof action on the top, which can make it harder for carbon and organic matter to be stored. So when old meadows are managed through these traditional haymaking activities, the soils don't become compacted, and all those different plant species have very different rooting depths, and they can draw down carbon and build those very deep organic soils. So old meadows store much more carbon, as well as supporting all the wildlife we looked at earlier. There's a lot of focus on tree planting at the moment. You've probably heard about it on the news and on social media. But at all the stages of succession that we looked at, create habitats that are valuable and support different sorts of life. To support the widest range of species possible, we need a variety of habitat types in our landscape, and preferably these should be joined up so species can move between them, and that helps them to distribute seeds and allows genetic exchange between populations in different parts of the landscape. We often see the greatest amount of biodiversity, and that's the number of different species present, at the edges between habitat types, so at the edges of woodlands and at field margins, that type of thing. Because there's a wide range of environmental conditions and food sources for the species to make use of. So having a mosaic of different habitat types across the landscape is really important. And you can see that in this extract from Google Maps. We have the River Thames, this is just west of Oxford, running through the middle of this picture. Alongside it, there are a number of floodplain meadows, including one of my study sites, that's Oxley Mead there in the red circle. At the top you can see there are some lakes and wetlands, and towards the bottom there's some areas of woodland, so there's a lot of stuff going on in this patch of landscape. My research is focusing particularly on these wet floodplain meadows, and these are a bit different from the dry upland meadows. They're naturally fertile because when they flood, nutrient-rich sediments are deposited, so they rarely need any other kind of fertiliser adding, making them really environmentally friendly part of any farm. And you can see all the sediments in the flood waters here on Oxley Mead, which is the meadow you saw circled on the last slide. So as well as supporting loads of biodiversity, they do a number of other useful things. We've already talked about how good meadows can be for carbon storage, and these wet meadows are especially good at storing carbon in the soils. When rivers flood onto the flood meadows, that not only fertilises the meadow, it also holds water on the land, and that allows it to drain away slowly. This helps to prevent flooding in towns and cities downriver, so it helps to prevent that urban flooding. However, many floodplains have been cut off from their rivers now. They've been drained, they've been built on or ploughed up for other types of farming. And in fact, 97% of our wildflower meadows have been lost since World War II, and there's less than 1,500 hectares of floodplain meadow remaining in the UK. So as well as losing all that fantastic biodiversity and releasing all the carbon that would have been stored in those deep organic soils, it means that floodwaters are channelled quickly downriver and cause damaging floods when they burst their banks in urban areas. So we've looked at some of the species you might see in the meadows, and we've talked about what meadows are and how they come to be. Let's have a look at how they fit into farming and why hay is important. Hay is basically preserved sunshine. It's long been the way that farmers have stored the product of summer sunshine to feed to the animals over the winter. Before mechanisation and the invention of chemical fertilisers, these naturally fertile floodplain meadows were more valuable than any other land type, than they were the fuel pump really of the horse-drawn society. They're still valuable now, especially with the rise in popularity of the nature-friendly farming and pasture-fed livestock. On this slide, in the top right-hand corner, that's actually my grandfather and great-grandfather farming and making hay in Sussex in the 1950s. So this was in the post-war agricultural revolution, where tractors were becoming much more common, and haymaking was really changing at that time. Hay is both food and medicine. As humans, we're told to eat a wide range of foods, including lots of fruit and veg, to be healthy. It's the same for animals. Good quality hay with a wide range of plant species can provide animals with lots of vitamins and minerals to keep them healthy. These nutrients, along with other plant medicinal compounds, can help animals resist infectious parasites, reducing reliance on chemical antibiotics and antiparasitic medicines that can be damaging both for the animals and for the environment. A healthy diet can also make the meat or dairy products from these animals tastier and healthier for consumers. You may have heard that you are what you eat, but you are what you eat has eaten. So as well as all the benefits of meadows we talked about earlier, hay is also an environmentally friendly way of making healthy food. So how do we balance farming and biodiversity? Many meadows today still form part of working farms, with hay being made to feed to the livestock during the winter. Other meadows are managed primarily to conserve wildlife, and haymaking is more of a byproduct. But one thing that both types of meadow managers need to get right is when to make the hay. Hay was traditionally made around midsummer, that's sort of late June time. At this time the meadow plants are lush, they're full of nutrients, but as the summer passes, the nutrients in the plants decline as the flowering finishes and seeds are shed, and this means the plants become tougher, more fibrous, they make a poorer quality feed. For haymaking for food, you want to cut it while it's lush and nutrient rich. But this is when other species are sort of insects and birds and things are using the meadows for a food source or to complete their life cycles, raise their young, nest, that kind of thing. This could be bees, other insects, ground nesting birds, like we've got the curlew on the slide here, and many others. So if you want to look after wildlife, you might not be happy about trying to cut the hay whilst they're still active at that time of year in the height of summer. In fact, many agri-environment schemes pay farmers to look after the land in a nature-friendly way, and they have rules about not cutting the hay before the middle of July, and this delay can make a big difference to hay quality. But these meadows have developed under this cycle of traditional haymaking that's been going on for perhaps hundreds of years. So what's the right thing to do here? Let's have a closer look at what happens to nutrients in the meadow system. So haymaking is part of an annual cycle of nutrients moving through the meadow, and plants are the pump that drives this. So we start with nutrients coming in from flood sediments, as we saw in the picture earlier. They're deposited across the meadow when rivers burst their banks. So plants take up these nutrients and move them from the soils into their above ground parts, into the leaves and flowers. So they take up the nutrients through their roots, and they build all the leaves and the flowers during the summer. After flowering and shedding their seeds, plants will reabsorb a lot of these nutrients back into their roots and store them for next year or for later on. So, haymaking needs to happen when the nutrients are still above ground to capture them in the hay. This removes the nutrients from the soil, so that the plant growth is pumping the nutrients out of the soil and we're taking it away in the hay. Grazing in the autumn after the haymaking also helps to remove any late summer growth that happens after the initial hay cut, and the action of hooves also makes lots of small kind of openings in the ground there, so seeds can find the soil and germinate the next spring. But why is removing nutrients from the soil a good thing? Well, it's all about how plants respond to soil nutrients. So let's have a look at another short video on how hay cutting affects meadow plants. This is a floodplain meadow. It's mid-July and you can see that the sward has grown tall and dense. If you look down here at the bottom, you can see that not much is able to grow underneath these tall competitive species. Historically, hay was cut on these wet meadows in late June, because this is the best way to produce a high-quality hay crop for agricultural use. It also ensures that nutrients are removed from the meadow before flowering finishes, when nutrients in the above-ground parts of the plants move back into below-ground stores. This helps to balance out the soil nutrients that arrive in flood sediments, and prevents competitive nutrient-loving plants from taking over. If the annual hay cut is left too late, or missed altogether,
Soil nutrients can build up, and you may see a reduction in the number of different species in the meadow as the smaller, low-growing species are crowded out. This is a quadrat that was cut in late June, about 3 weeks ago, and you can see that already it's starting to recover. This is because meadow species have a survival strategy involving underground energy stores and bud banks, so they have everything they need to spring back to life quickly after haymaking and have a second flush, providing good autumn grazing. You might be concerned that a June cut wouldn't allow these wildflowers time to set seed and reproduce. However, many of these are long-lived species that can reproduce by forming clones without the need for seed. What might surprise you is that some of these delicate-looking plants may actually be over 100 years old, at least as old as many of the trees and hedges nearby, and only need to set seed on those occasional years when hay cutting is delayed due to flooding or bad weather. But it is essential that hay is cut and removed every year, so that the litter from old growth doesn't block light and space from the early low-growing species the following spring. This cycle of summer hay cutting and aftermath grazing ensures a broad range of plants will continue to thrive here in the long term, providing a diverse habitat structure and varied food sources for invertebrates and other animals who rely on these high nature value meadows.
So you can see how different plants react differently to soil nutrients. Some plants we call stress tolerators because they've evolved to grow in difficult conditions. They often grow slowly, but have adaptations to help them cope with stresses like drought, low nutrients or being grazed. You heard in the last video how some meadow plants reproduce by forming clones and can be over 100 years old. Think about that. These little meadow plants could be older than the trees and hedges nearby. Other plants are competitive. They like lots of nutrients, and when they get them they grow tall very quickly, beating other species to the light and crowding out those lower, slower growing species. So if you have lots of soil nutrients, you end up with a meadow full of just a few species of these tall competitive plants, like the nettles on the left here. When you have low soil nutrients, these competitive species can still grow, but not so quickly, and this gives the smaller stress tolerator species time to keep up. So to have the widest range of species in your meadow, more like on the right of this picture, you need to keep the soil nutrients low. And the best way to do that is by taking away as many nutrients as possible in the hay. It's a win-win. Making great hay helps maintain plant diversity, and plant diversity supports all the animal life in the meadow. So that's why it's important to know when is the best time to cut hay. But how do you know when the nutrients are at their highest? This is me setting out my study site back in the summer, and I'll show you how I did that. So, as scientists, we can analyse hay in the lab to find out the nutrient content on the day it was cut. But you can only analyse a very small amount at a time, just a few grams, so you can't test the whole meadow. And it can be quite varied, the amount of nutrients between sort of one patch and the next, depending on which species you find there. So we have to do this by taking samples from random locations across meadow sites to get a picture of what's going on across the whole meadow. And we do this using a quadrat, which is a 1 by 1 metre frame, which you can see in the picture here. And if we do that carefully on a number of different meadows, we can use that data to understand what's going on in other similar meadows. And that's what I've been doing. During the summer, I was able to go out to my 3 study sites and take samples that I'll be analysing in the lab over the winter. So let's have a look at one final short video on how I did that. This one was filmed at Oxley Mead, which is a small floodplain in Milton Keynes. So that's the kind of thing that field scientists get up to. But for all the time spent out in nature and crawling around in meadows there's much more to be done back in the lab to sort, prepare and analyse the samples. And also at the computer to run statistical models to find patterns in the data, to test hypotheses and to come up with recommendations. But what difference does all that science make? Other than being great fun, of course. Having good data on how nutrients are moving through the meadows, from the soils up into the plants, will help land managers and farmers know how better to manage their meadows, to help maintain the good ones and to improve the not so good ones. This will help them to make a nutritious hay crop, whilst at the same time supporting wildlife, storing carbon to combat climate change and helping to reduce flooding. So how's that for multitasking? These meadows are a great example of how humans can have a positive impact on the landscape through sustainable farming. I hope that the next time you look out at a meadow, whether you're out on a walk or from a car window, you'll think about what an amazing system they are, forming an important part of our farmed landscape, and appreciate that making food doesn't have to be destructive. If you want to find out more about meadow science, do check out the websites linked here. Thanks for listening.